When we observe the external world, everything feels straightforward. We see it through our eyes, we hear it with our ears, and our senses give us a stable picture of reality. But the moment we turn our attention inward, toward our mental lives, a different set of questions emerges. Who is observing what? Which part of us is doing the observing, and which parts are being observed? For thousands of years, these questions were left to philosophy, religion, and mysticism. But in today's world, they demand an explanation that is scientific, grounded, and relatable. This is the purpose of this program, to present a clear model of the psyche based entirely on direct experience. A model that anyone can verify for themselves simply by paying attention. To do that, we must redefine some familiar psychological concepts and introduce a few new ones. Let's begin with the metaphor. After many years of trying to isolate a single stable element of mental life, I kept running into the same problem. Nothing stayed still. Thoughts and emotions traded places. Impulses turned into beliefs and then back again. Urges dissolved into memories, and at other times they seemed to appear out of nowhere. The instability of the entire situation forced me to approach the subject from a different angle. Since brain activity is, at least in part, electrical in nature, I began comparing my internal observations to the familiar behavior of electricity in physics. To my surprise, as I continued examining my experience through this lens, the confusion that had surrounded mental processes for years began to dissolve. In nature, an electrical current cannot exist without a magnetic field, but a magnetic field can exist without an electrical current. When applied to mental life, this relationship becomes unexpectedly illuminating. An emotional current cannot exist without a cognitive field, but a cognitive field can exist on its own, capable of interfering with existing currents or generating new ones, provided the right internal conditions arise within the closed system of the mind. Even though this is only a metaphor, it illustrates something essential. Thought and emotion are not separate entities. They co-create the situation as a whole. The purpose of this metaphor is not to explain mental activity, but to shift the point of reference from which we observe it. With this shift in place, we can begin the presentation of the internal system that becomes the subject of self-analysis. The first component of mental life that is to be examined is the mental state. In everyday language, we call it the mood, the vibe, the general feeling, or something similar. A mental state is the psychological climate in which the activities of the mind take place. It can be understood as an internal atmosphere surrounding everything that happens within mental life. What matters most is this: the mental state always corresponds to what the mind is doing at the moment. When the activity shifts, the background condition shifts with it. This is not theoretical, it is directly observable in daily life. When you pick up a book and begin reading, your mental state reorganizes into one that supports reading. When you put the book down, go outside and socialize, the mental state adjusts again. When you sit down and scroll, the atmosphere changes once more. The mental state always responds to the activity. And because it is a background condition, it cannot be controlled directly. You cannot will yourself into a different mental state. Only by changing the activity can you change the atmosphere in which the mind operates. I emphasize this now because in part 3, learning how to manage the mental state becomes crucial, and in fact, it forms the foundation of the entire methodology of this system. The next component of mental life is what I call the surface layer chatter. This is the part of the mind most people are familiar with. It is loud, verbal, emotionally charged, and often intrusive. Sometimes you can control it, other times it seems to control you. This layer is narrative driven. It rationalizes and verbalizes both external events and internal conditions by associatively linking them with past experiences. It is constantly interpreting, commenting, and reacting. Not all surface activity remains on the surface. Under certain conditions, some of it penetrates deeper into the mind and influences behavior. When you first begin observing this layer, much of it may seem chaotic or meaningless. But with persistent observation over time, patterns begin to emerge, and a clear conclusion arises. None of it is random. Everything that happens on the surface is connected to deeper layers of the mind. Take intrusive thoughts, for example. These are surface level events that people often label as unnecessary or irrational. But if we look more closely, there is usually an unresolved problem in the person's life directly connected to the intrusive thought. And as these things tend to unfold, the intrusive thought triggers painful memories, past traumas, and catastrophic interpretations, each of which is itself an unresolved issue. The chain becomes obvious once you see it. The surface layer chatter is far more important than we tend to assume. It deserves careful attention because it is the most accessible window into the deeper architecture of the mind. The final foundational component of mental life is the command layer. This part of the mind has a directive function and is experienced as a buildup of somatic tension that releases as an impulse to act. Any deliberate decision to perform an action outside your normal behavior repertoire reveals this mechanism clearly. For example, imagine deciding to wash your face 3 times with cold water for no other reason than to observe the internal process. You can feel the sequence unfold, the buildup of tension, the initiation of action, the movement towards it, the performance, and the aftermath. The entire chain becomes visible. When this understanding is applied to everyday life, it becomes clear that actions integrated into our behavior as habits lose their initial buildup and become largely automatic. The command layer is still active, but its impulses no longer require conscious initiation. It is important to recognize that the command layer is always functioning. In the case of procrastination, for instance, The psyche is not passive. It is responding actively to the task at hand. The command layer is firing at full force, generating impulses that oppose the intended action. There is nothing passive about procrastination or any other mental process commonly labeled as such. This leads to the most important insight about the command layer. Only one impulse can be dominant at a time. This may seem simple, but it gives us enormous room to maneuver. What appears to be a problem on the surface is often a solution at a deeper level when it comes to internal conflict. This concludes the basic components of mental life. I have deliberately left functions such as attention, memory, and similar processes undefined, simply because they are intuitive and familiar to everyone. With the fundamentals established, we can now move on to the more complex processes. In this model, a belief is not an object hidden somewhere in the psyche. It is an event. More precisely, it is a convergence of the mental state, the surface layer chatter, and the command layer in a specific pattern that ultimately expresses itself as behavior. The only reliable way to uncover the true nature and context of a belief is to work backwards, starting from the behavior it produces. Only after the chain of events has been tracked to its source can we begin to treat beliefs conceptually as integrated attitudes. Before that point, the belief is not a thing, it is a process. What we want to identify is the exact mental state in which the surface layer chatter successfully communicates with the command layer to produce an impulse to act. This may seem complex because it is. Integrated beliefs reveal themselves through the regularity of behavior. When the same response appears in the same pattern again and again, this is precisely the material we want to work with. In part 3, we will uncover specific chains of events in order to get ahead of the behavior and interfere with the production of an impulse. For now, there is no need to go into further detail. In practice, beliefs rarely exist as single events within the psyche. More often, they are organized into multi-layered processes stacked on top of one another. I refer to these structures as belief chains. It is almost impossible to discuss belief chains without addressing childhood imprinting. When a child encounters an environment that is not suited for children, the young mind lacks the reference points needed to construct a counter-interpretation. It cannot explain the hostility. Instead, it registers the experience as the way the world works and proceeds to build a life on top of that assumption. When the situation ends, the conclusions formed do not simply disappear. They are displaced onto other areas of life. As a result, an adult may carry integrated beliefs of shame, guilt, fear, or inadequacy into their behavioral patterns, often without any apparent rhyme or reason. This is the reason. The mind does not automatically correct early errors. It organizes them as coherently as it can. This naturally brings us to the last component of this system that is subject to self-analysis: relationships. Relationships do not exist in external reality. There are no strings or bonds connecting people out in the world. What we call a relationship is an internal phenomenon, a connection between psychic representations of people, including the representation of oneself, which functions as the core idea of self. This means that every relationship is internal before it is external. What we experience as closeness, distance, conflict, attachment, resentment, admiration, or fear is not a property of the other person, but a property of the internal representative we carry of them. The external individual may trigger the process, but the relationship itself unfolds entirely within the mind. Relationships are not limited to people. The psyche forms relationships with places, objects, events, memories, and even abstract ideas. Philosophical systems, ethical principles, religious concepts, political ideologies, all of these are treated by the mind as relational partners. They occupy positions within the internal architecture, influence the mental state, interfere with surface chatter, and activate the command layer just as vividly as living individuals do. Because relationships exist internally, they must be studied internally. The external world provides a stimulus, but the structure, meaning, and emotional weight of the relationship are determined by the internal system. When we analyze relationships, we are not analyzing how things are between two people. We are analyzing how the psyche organizes its representatives, how the belief chains shape expectations, and how impulses are generated in response to these internal configurations. This is why relationships are the final component of the system. They are where all previous elements, mental state, surface chatter, command layer, and belief chains converge into a single dynamic field. Relationships reveal the architecture of the psyche more clearly than anything else because they activate every layer at once. With this, the foundational structure of the psyche is complete. We have outlined the basic components of mental life, the mechanisms through which they interact, and the patterns through which they organize themselves into stable forms. None of this requires speculation, ideology, or theoretical allegiance. It is all accessible through direct experience, available to anyone willing to observe their own mind with precision and patience.